Chapter 1. Calix sat in the passenger seat of the car, his gaze fixed on the world outside. Rain was dripping down from the clouds like a poison, thumping against the ground and coating the road in water. Calix buried his head in his sleeve, trying to ignore the crackling storm. He didn't hate rain, he just hated what it reminded him of. What he couldn't seem to forget. It had only been 3 weeks since the rain had poured down in a tidal wave, drowning out the sound of the bombs. Only 3 weeks since the terrible night he had been pinned under the flagpole, hearing screams from the people he loved and unable to do a thing about it. The night he thought would be his last. Calix reached down to touch his new prosthetic, feeling a fresh wave of despair at the sight of the silver medal. It was almost unbearable, but he refused to make a sound. The last thing he wanted to do was cry, not around Miss Kinnian, who was far too pleased considering the current situation. Her overall demeanor was shockingly bright. From her blonde hair to her neon yellow cardigan, her entire appearance screamed friendly. Calix was surprised he hadn't gone blind. She was on the larger size. Her face blushed like a cherry tomato. Her horns, the only thing on her that it seemed even close to threatening, had been beveled at the ends like she had smoothed them over with a nail file. For someone who works with traumatized children, you seem oddly chipper, he thought wryly. He was almost positive this lady hadn't had a bad day in her life. Whoever hired her probably had the best intent, but Calix didn't really care at this point. "We're here," Miss Kinnian exclaimed cheerfully, her face even brighter with the street lights illuminating her tanned skin. Calix abruptly sat up, fixing her with a sharp glare. Miss Kinnian's warm smile dropped, worry crossing her face for the first time all trip. "Are you okay, dear? I promise Uncle Trent is really quite nice," she soothed. "I know it won't be the same, but he's your family, too." Calix felt a stab of guilt. It's not her fault, he thought, tail curling beside himself in a flickering coil. But he couldn't quite bring himself to be any more polite with all the thoughts clouding in his head. His parents always told him to be grateful. He tried that, but the only thing he thought about was home, his real home, away from the hospitals and the social workers. And he really wanted people to stop telling him it was going to be okay. "I'm fine," he murmured, pulling out the nicest expression he could manage. "Thank you for the ride." "That's great, dear. Do you need some help getting inside?" She briefly glanced at the silver prosthetic below his knee, causing Calix to shrink back in his seat. He didn't want to be that kid. "No, that's all right." Calix opened the car door, the sun barely peeking over the dispersing clouds. He stepped onto the rough pavement, surprised at how easy walking was. The artificial leg was hired with all kinds of tech, to the point that it functioned almost identically to the original. That still didn't fix much, though. It was just a tiny fleck of silver on the pile of awfulness life had just dealt him. He reached behind the seats and grabbed his tattered green and blue duffel bag. Hoisting it over his shoulders, he ambled up the polished stairs to the door of his uncle's house and went into the hall. The place was huge, almost 5 times the size of Calix's old home. If he hadn't known better, he could have mistaken it for the palace itself. The walls were pure oak wood. He could make out little shapes that resembled flames etched into the smooth tile flooring. His uncle's status as the Queen's top general had clearly earned him a small fortune, and he lived like a king because of it. Calix turned to the desk, seeing a pale man wearing a tidy suit. He bore an uncanny likeness to him, the same flickering blue eyes and a flaming tail. This man had to be his uncle, looking almost exactly how Calix imagined himself in 30 years. Except, Uncle looked broken. Not on the outside. He was taller than most and quite handsome for his age. But his face was so pale, not even close to Calix and the rest of his family. He lacked the strong arms and broad shoulders of most of Calix's relatives, which was a result of many strict hours in the forges. He had clearly spent most of his days inside, lacking a distinctive tan. Uncle looked clearly related to Calix's dad, but he had none of that warm certainty that always seemed to radiate from Father. Father smelled like roasted marshmallows, and his strong golden eyes made everyone around him feel safe. Uncle's eyes felt almost wrong, and the light blue flames reminded Calix of melting ice. "Who are you?" Uncle rasped from his place behind the desk. Calix kept his eyes on the floor, sliding the hospital letter towards his uncle with shaking hands. He unwrapped the letter, reading it over while the words were printed out in Arial bold. The paper was so crisp and technical, and it made Calix's chest hurt to see the circumstances laid out so simply. Those words represented the rest of his life, and they hadn't even bothered to change the basic font. His uncle finished reading, setting the letter face down on his desk. His usually pale skin turned sheet white, and the flames in his eyes grew until he almost looked like he was burning from the inside out. "I was told you had survived the bombing," he said quietly, tail flicking tiny embers onto the desk. "I did." "What about my brother?" He didn't make it." Calix felt the small flame on his tail flaring up, leaving burns in his uncle's once perfect floor. I'm sorry." Uncle looked him over, expression twisted into a gruesome frown. "You can stay in the room upstairs." His uncle was glancing from side to side, as if his nephew's presence alone would send bombs coming in from the ceiling. "You have school in the morning." Calix bowed awkwardly, rushing up the stairs before his uncle could say another word. He didn't want to spend another minute in this place. Not with Uncle. Calix spent the rest of his day searching for a bit of his old optimism, and wishing he was anywhere but here.